Welcome, everyone. In this chat session, we're going to talk to a couple of teachers from Ontario about their perspective on inclusive education. In these chat sessions, we give you a chance to hear from people across Canada who are working to make inclusion a reality in our schools. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and my co-hosts for this chat are Diane Richler, who's the chair of the Catalyst on Inclusive Education Initiative of Inclusion International. Diane's also a former executive vice president of what's now Inclusion Canada, and she's worked on inclusive education not only in this country, but on a global level. Our other co-host is Jackie Specht, who's a professor of education at Western University in London, Ontario. And Jackie works with a number of researchers across the country and actually directs the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education from her university in London. And we welcome to our chat today our two guests. Our first, Missy Pfaff, who's an educator with 30 plus years of experience with the Avon Maitland District School Board in Ontario. She's taught throughout the school system. She's been a leader in an initiative to make the schools in her district inclusive. Had a number of different positions. Right now, she's principal of a school, and her colleague and co-worker is Amy Kipfer, who's an educator, has been a classroom teacher, a learning services coordinator, Indigenous and equity education lead, and with Missy has worked to promote inclusion across the board in the Avon Maitland District. Right now, she's working in a program involving distance education within her district. So we welcome both of you, and maybe let's start with you, Amy. Tell us a little bit about what inclusion, why you believe inclusion is worth working on in our schools.
So many reasons, I imagine, but what comes to mind is our experience, and Missy will speak to this as well, our firsthand experience of moving through this process where we were teachers in classrooms, including students that at the time met some criteria to be in segregated classes or special education classes, and then moving to work at the system level and kind of getting a full breadth of understanding of what could happen in an inclusive classroom in their home community school versus being sent away. In our rural board, often it meant being sent out of the school and sent to another place for their education. And just getting that firsthand experience, knowing it can work in a classroom, and then also being able to see what was happening in the segregated classes and knowing that they weren't getting the full breadth of education, they weren't getting the social inclusion, and sometimes the family support where they could be getting that at the home school. So for me, it's a model that works, and every student should have the right and access to.
Missy, what about you?
Yeah, I have a similar tone, and it comes from having some experience outside of in multiple school buildings. So whether that's moving around a lot in your career as an educator or being at the system level. But I taught at the beginning of my career in a school that students traditionally had never gone to self-contained classes, even though they were available to them. The school community, the family community chose not to send them. So that was the norm. That was how we did things. And then I moved around into another position where part of my role was to counsel parents to say, as a school board, we can serve your child better in a self-contained program. That was part of my job, to help deliver that message. And then went and saw those programs, and the dichotomy of the two things that I noticed from my early teaching experience, where students with complex support needs were in the regular classroom, working alongside their peers in both social and academic endeavors, and then a very personalized program, skill-based program in self-contained that often I noticed was not age respectful, or it was more in line with the scores in their intellectual assessments than it was with their age. And then the third juxtaposition that I think I saw is often the students in their communities. So a story I often tell is a student who had continued in about his third or fourth year of high school to learn the names of the coins, in his math class, and had been working on that for a number of years. And yet he could reach into his pocket and uptown and pull out exactly what he needed to get a Coke out of the Coke machine. And that difference between what we think was a skill that we needed to teach in school and what the child actually needed to be a member of society were very, very different. So my conclusion to all that is that inclusive education is really, really important for us to see that perspective of kids getting literacy, numeracy alongside their peers, as well as all the life skills, not the traditional, sometimes special education life skills, but life skills of being with their peers in regular classrooms is so, so critical.
So you both were part of a district-wide effort to increase inclusion in your schools. Can you tell us a little bit about how you made that happen? What kind of support you provided to the schools to make inclusion an initiative that they could embrace?
Yeah, Gordon, I was looking at a few things before we came on here and just looking at some dates to kind of give a timeline of it. And it started, and it's a very important piece to our story of how it started. And it started at the system level with our director creating our strategic directions for the outset of 4 years and really wanting to include that work in the system's work. So we started with a statement that said we would create positive, inclusive learning environments for all students. And from that statement, we got to kind of unpack what that could look like and how that would impact special education, which is now our learning services department, and the work that we do there. So we really started kind of one kid at a time, one situation at a time, where people wanted to do the work, where people were willing and able, and then start to build on sharing those experiences across the system, and then partnering it with kind of equity understanding and what were the rights of the students at this time. And the framework that was created to do that movement and that work was a coaching team. So under the guidance of Peggy Blair, our superintendent at that time, she was able to allow us to create a team that was kindergarten to grade 12 educators, both from the regular class and self-contained setting, to create a rich, supportive network for us to do this system out in the schools. And that team fluctuated from time to time from about 10 educators to 15. We are a bit of a smaller school with 39 schools in total, 9 secondary, and the rest being elementary. So that's kind of a bit of a structural sense, and I'll pass it over to Missy to talk about kind of some of those supports we offered to the schools.
Sure, thanks, Amy. The team itself was interesting in its makeup because we wanted to have a team of educators that weren't all special educators by training. We definitely had some, but we also had good classroom teachers, good educator practitioners who knew the curriculum well and would be perhaps some of those teachers that might put up barriers to inclusion because they were so focused on making sure that their curriculum expectations were attended to properly, and in secondary talking about credit integrity and whatnot. So the mix of the team became very important. So we had some street cred, if for lack of a better word, with teachers who might think that this team didn't understand what it was like in a regular classroom. And we worked with the teachers who were willing, as part of Peggy's direction and as part of our training as coaching, is that we needed to get our foot in the door to work with teachers, and we established partnerships as opposed to coming in as an expert. So it was really a coaching at the elbow approach and digging in and problem solving with teachers who would present, well, as perhaps the science expert. I'm the science teacher expert, and the coach would come in and say, well, I understand the profile of the student. Let's share our knowledge, reciprocate our knowledge, and come up with a solution. And it was those partnerships and the trust that was developed that moved the work forward, one kid at a time, one teacher at a time. And then the kids basically took it over, because once the staff actually got to know the students, they became, much like they do with all their kids, enamored with what they could do and surprised by what they could do. And it started the ball rolling.
Why do you think it was so important to start with those people who really wanted to do this and to have that coaching model as opposed to the expert model?
I think it was a process of kind of meeting people where they were at to begin, and knowing that this work, this work wasn't, the work was already in research. We knew that, but we knew we had ideals of teachers and educators throughout the system and families who were advocating for this. Not an overwhelming amount, but we knew we had some. So we knew if we could work in those areas, we could start sharing that story, because when we were sharing research, and other educators will probably find this, you can present research that is even in your provincial context, but until you own it as a school board, people don't always come along with the progress of the change. So we knew we needed some of our own narratives from our home communities and our educators who would spread that knowledge in the schools themselves.
Yeah, I think there was a notion that belief had to come before practice. So that we, if you believed in the why, you had that sort of moral imperative, then you would work hard and get the job done. I think in our learning, we also discovered that the reverse is true. So we would have had teachers that at some point said, okay, I don't think this is right, but just tell me how to do it and I'll do it. I'll be compliant. And they too transformed their practice. So I believe there is a back and forth there that initially we didn't believe was there.
Explain, like, why did this start? I mean, to start with that kind of leadership, what was the motivation?
Go ahead, Amy.
Go ahead. From knowing Peggy, I think it was her extensive background that partnered very well with our director vision. Our director had close relations with our Catholic school board, and many Catholic school boards do have some of this practice already in place. So I think he was seeing, our director at the time was seeing that this could happen, and started asking questions around it, and then started asking questions of superintendents, or actually I believe that they hired Peggy for this work specifically, who had an extensive background in multiple school boards in special education, and had a vision of moving this work forward, knowing the research and knowing the work in depth.
I think, Diane, to add to that, we were also seeing the trend with our families. So being a small school board and rural, we didn't have self-contained special education classes in all of our schools. So students would have to leave their home community to be educated if that's the program they selected. And we were starting to see a decline in the number of applications to those self-contained programs, and families were wanting to keep their students in their home schools with their siblings and their community, members, the kids' friends. And so that was part of what we were seeing. The other, at the time, there was a heavy focus on data in education and whether we were actually meeting the goals in those self-contained classes, in those programs. And we were seeing not great academic progress in the work of those self-contained classes. And even if we looked at the alternative curriculum that was largely provided in those programs, there was a lack of progress as well. We'd see sometimes the same goals over and over, year after year. So I think at the system level, this was sort of prior to Amy and my involvement, but I think at the system level, they were looking at a program that didn't actually bear any fruit in terms of educational growth.
And what's the reaction been from neighboring school boards and other school boards in Ontario?
We have had a lot of visitors come forth to kind of take a tour through our schools and meet with the department. And so we have had a good reaction that way. We did have we did have families move into our district to explore inclusion, and we have had some families that left. I can't say a whole lot. I can't recall that we had a lot move, but as people were unpacking what that meant for them and their families and trying to understand what this would offer their child as they grow up, people were kind of exploring what that would look like. So I think it was kind of a bit of a mixed reaction in that sense, but nothing overtly negative. Missy?
So we might have started with this, but the Avon Maitland School Board, can you just give us a sense for people who don't know exactly where that is, what the dimensions of the district are, where it is, and so on?
Yeah, it's in southwestern Ontario, and our major centers, some would be Stratford, which many people would be familiar with. Goes to the edge of Lake Huron in the Goderich area, running south to approximately Grand Bend, and then borders Middlesex County. What would be to your what would be at your end? Blue Water and
Upper Grand, and we
Upper
border
Grand,
Waterloo.
yeah,
So
about
we border a lot.
15,000 students approximately, and I think Amy said about 39 elementary and secondary schools.
Okay, I have another question, and that's about the role of university faculty in working with you and supporting what you were doing. How much was that a factor, and how did that come about?
I think it was quite a large factor. So as educators and our team, we were going through some unlearning of what we thought special education to be. And as you would all know, and your listeners would know, our special education practices and kind of principles that rule our schools were created in the 1980s. So we kind of got stuck there, I think, as educators. And so then we were looking and reaching out to our university faculties to kind of update our learning and understanding of what are the best practices for students with complex needs. So we had partnerships with Sheila Bennett and Jackie Specht. We have partnerships with Stephen Katz and how to help administrators go through the process of change within their school board and their community. We worked a lot with Michael Giangreco, who is the leading research on educational assistants or paraprofessionals. And then Gordon, yourself, I have you listed here too as well, because we did some work with you, just kind of understanding a more global context and a more Canadian context, because we do have provincial leaders in this work, but they seem to not be public school boards in Ontario.
Missy, any comment on the university role in supporting you?
I think it was critical because I think the reality in public education is that research doesn't get to us. We might get the odd book study here and there, but schools are busy places, and teachers tend not to look to the research to inform their practice as much. And so having that connection with university faculty who live and breathe the research aspect and can nicely translate that for us into practical terms was critical to our success.
Do you think that you reached a tipping point? You know, the concept of the tipping point. Do you think you're over that crest and that inclusion is going to be seen differently now in your schools as a result of your work?
Yeah,
I'll start with my opinion. Amy's always the optimist for sure. It depends, I think, on what level you look at it. So if you look at in a typical school, I would agree with Amy. I think yes, and we're seeing more and more of practices that happen in school boards that principals and teachers are challenging based on what they've learned about inclusion. So we're uncovering even more and more things to update and change at a practical level. At the system level, I still think there are pressures on the decision makers that sometimes will push us back to that 1980s type model. You know, when you have parental pressure or union pressure or some kind of pressure that says this is not working, instead of digging in and problem solving, it's much easier to go back to the way it was, despite the fact that that may not have been working either.
The way it was being self-contained special education.
Yes, yes. So I think we can't take our feet off the accelerator in doing this work. And I remember sitting with many of you at roundtable discussions with boards that have called themselves inclusive for many years, and we're still working hard to make sure that it was something that was living and breathing every day.
So what's the Optimist have to say?
I think absolutely we are there with the majority. Again, as Missy says, there are situations that creep up and people aren't sure how to handle them, but have past experience that says, well, if we put them over here, then maybe that would quiet that situation. But I do believe with the emphasis and spotlight on equity now, we will come to understand that ableism has not always been our friend in our long history of education, and that therein too lies the equity work. And so we are now able to help people understand, as we start to understand other facets of diversity, what it is around this community or these learners that we need to do as educators, and that this might be heavier work than learning terms or pieces around marginalization of other communities, because we are the educators that need to continue to program and assess these students. But if we can start looking at it in that context, I think that we will continue to have success. And I really do advocate and talk to about our ministry, bringing those pieces together. Special education is so far over here, and we have a lot of great equity work happening over here, and somehow we're missing that link. And I do hope that we have leaders in our province that can start to make those links, because then I think other people will come to understand it better and unpack their own minds around ableism.
I share that hope, but I'm wondering, like, what can we do besides hope? Why does that gap exist? Why can people not understand that equity means that you need to look differently at traditional special education? And, do you have any ideas of how advocates could share your experience with decision makers to be able to make a shift? Because on a provincial level, we're very far from a tipping point in terms of a move to inclusion.
I think about that kind of equity stance that a lot of people are taking around who's in the room. So if we are concerned, like I would raise the point that we have so much money being spent on special education at a ministry level. Who is in the room when you're making those larger decisions, and why aren't they in on the equity work? And I've had a journey where I went from special education into equity work, and I always saw that as a piece of my role to bring that into the room and talk about how marginalization, or the work of Gillian Preck, will show you that you cannot unpack all the equity stuff without understanding special education and how we've compartmentalized people, and use that view of streaming people. It is all connected, but it takes time and space and advocacy, which you all know.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And that's, you speak to my point about keeping our foot on the accelerator, Diane, because I see us having to make explicit connections between equity, diversity, inclusion work to include those with special education needs, because it's often seen as two very separate issues. I don't know whether that's a historical piece. I think it speaks to our broader understanding and our broader systemic tolerance or acceptance of individuals with special education needs in our community. So it takes people that can explicitly make those bridges. Amy and I both are sitting on our own school board's equity and diversity committee, which has a focus on Black racism, LGBTQ, lots of other equity topics. It has yet to bring up special education specifically, but they do refer back to our journey and our change process that we've gone through as a school board as a model of how we can change our practice. So we have a little bit of a niche there to continue to make those points.
So what do you think the lessons learned have been from your journey with inclusive education?
I think that it needs to start at the top, or the top leadership really needs to be open to making this change and learning alongside. You need people who are brave and who are going to come together as a team to work together to kind of rise to any challenge, or be creative thinkers around how you will work through it. You definitely do need this system level approach, because you do need funding, you do need access. And all those things have to happen at a board level.
I would agree. Leadership is really important, but if we don't have that, then we still need to work at it at whatever level you exist at, one child and one person at a time. The power of that is still there. It takes a little bit longer when you don't have the permission, if you will, to pave the way from a systems approach, but it is still important to continue the work.
I'm thinking we're not supposed to ask questions of each other, but I really have a question for Jackie in this context, because in the chats that we've had so far, there's been a lot of emphasis on teacher training. We haven't talked a lot about how to shape the thinking of administrators. You know, what are people learning as they prepare to move into leadership positions? And it's great to see that both of you have actually moved into those kinds of positions, at least at the school level. But I'm just wondering how much more of a role our faculties of education can play in shaping the view to create the kind of leaders that you're talking about.
Well, I mean, I think that's certainly some of the work that I've been involved with Steve Sider, and we are looking at how do people who are beginning in their role as vice principals or principals see inclusion, and what are those issues? And I think it comes down to the leadership courses that we teach. The master's and doctoral level work is certainly important for that. That's really what we have control over. And so we do find people who come back to do their graduate work, get more involved in the research, and then can take that back to their practice, which is, I think, so important. And I think that's why we see that when we see practitioners working with researchers, it really is the best. And so, you know, we need to continue that role as faculties of education to promote inclusive leadership for the graduate students, and also then work with people who are in the field to do the research, to show that it can be done, to show the successes like the Avon Maitland board. And because that's, I think, as Missy said, it's sort of what sells it, right? It's not just the research, it's your own narratives that are happening, and this can be done. The people on the ground do this work. It's not somebody sitting in an ivory tower telling you what to do. So I think the same is with administrators, as we've seen with teachers.
But so both Amy and Missy, you've moved into those kinds of positions, so you've had to take some of those courses. Do you have advice to give to people in faculties of education on what they could do to be preparing your colleagues better, so that it's not just in one gem region of Ontario, but spreads around a bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if Amy and I compared our principals qualification courses, they would look very different because of the people leading them. But I would say there's not enough focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion in the courses that I experienced. And in fact, I'm currently taking the Ontario Principals Council's course for principals in special education. Not that I need to learn how to do it, it's been my life's work, but more to see what the influence is and see what the perspective is from inclusive education. And I've just started, but so far I'm pleased that inclusive language is in everything I've done so far, but I'll continue to monitor that and provide my feedback at the end of the course for sure.
And I think from my experience moving through the principal courses, it is kind of this heavy emphasis on those practices and kind of the legislation that was created in the 1980s, because they want to protect the administrators to make, you know, careful decisions going forward. But it's the time is spent on trying to understand that framework, which is dated now, what, 30, you know, 30 or more years. So there isn't this pairing with equity. So that, I would say, those are the pieces that we need to be mindful of those who are leading those courses, is to connect the equity pieces, and then how do you take that 1980s framework and move it forward to make space for inclusive education, because some of that is really restricting and creates anxiety or fear amongst new administrators to get it right, and so they rest on their laurels of what they think has worked before.
And that's the last word. Our time's up. Missy and Amy, thank you so much for being with us. You both written things that we posted on our Inclusive Education Canada website, And we certainly would be happy to share anything you want to share with our followers in the future. Missy, in particular, if you want to share with us your conclusions when you finish this training program, I'm sure that would be of interest. And I want to thank you both. Keep up the good work. And it's always inspiring to see people at the school level working vigorously to make inclusion happen. Thanks so much.